Chapter 34, the final chapter of the Age of Innocence, reads more like a coda than an actual integrated chapter. It's an enormous time lapse has taken place. We are suddenly in 25 years later, roughly. The major conflict has been resolved. The question of whether or not Newland will stay with his family or chuck it all for life with Olenska. The past 2 to 3 decades have proven that. He remains very much a creature of that New York society. He recognizes the limits of his individuality within the unbendable structure of that particular civilization. That is realism. What follows after this point, throughout chapter 34, is a kind of the lingering nuance of modernism that Wharton leaves for the rest of the 20th century to develop. The chapter begins with a reference itself to writing, or at least to the attempt or the conspicuous non-writing, if you will. We're told that Newland Archer sat at the writing table in his library in East 39th Street. That's significant. He's sitting there. It doesn't say he's actually writing. This isn't a representation of writing. This is the absence of writing. Perhaps the failure to communicate, maybe, but it is an art in abeyance. He is just sitting there, existing in a kind of locus of artistic appreciation, but he has not actually written anything. We're also told that Archer sits there in the library. As he sits there, it is the scene that he is using to remember so much of his past life. And this catches all of us up to what has been going on for the last few decades. The library is how he views, or is the lens through which he views his life. We're told that this is the scene of his solitary musings and of all the family confabulations. I love that word, confabulations. But it's how he is viewing his life through that locus of art, through that locus of literature specifically. For the past quarter century, he has been musing, perhaps. And that's an interesting word in itself. Musing would include his notable stream of consciousness from that first half of the novel that we've spoken about so much, that meditation that was so powerful and seemed to portend so much. But now that has all been diminished somehow to musings, something that's just sort of toying around in his brain, not something particularly seriously. It's diminished. The scrapbook of images that he has is notable for all being family confabulations, but again, very little reading or writing in that library. This is something that, again, we're told in an earlier part when he was younger, when he first got that shipment of books in from London, and he sat in the library and just immersed himself in all of those titles and was so excited to have them. Now that seems to be almost an afterthought. The books exist in the library, perhaps as mere decoration. They're not referenced at all in this final chapter, which again suggests that something else is going on here. The library is a scene of something other than literature at this moment. The library is where Newland's life has happened, an essentially passive experience of life. Yet it is the library that is a locale of art, reading and experiencing art. It's notable that the aesthetic object isn't literature, but rather life itself. The comings and goings of his family and the scenes of it, the raising of his family, all these things now perhaps mean more to him than anything that he could have read in those walls. Newland's art is his life. But like the literature, he's really not writing at the writing desk. His is an art of abstention, of renunciation. The art of his life is refraining to act rather than actually taking action. But through the lens of this art and this life as art, we do learn the details of Archer's life. We learn about his kids that he and May had, a son and a daughter. The daughter has been married to, quote, the dullest and most reliable son of one of Newland's friends, a name that rings from our past understanding of the novel, and way back when we have a dim recollection of, oh yeah, that guy, he was sort of always in the group. That sense of the insularity of the society as well, how they're all just kind of marrying one another at this point. The son, named Dallas, works as an architect, an artist, essentially. Well, an artist in reality. We are told specifically that the young men nowadays were emancipating themselves from the law and business and taking up all sorts of new things. So there's a sense of the time passing and the mores changing over that time. The younger generation is freer from the restraints that so hemmed in Newland. Newland perhaps would have liked to be an artist, to follow that instinct. But remember all of his interactions with his friend, the newspaper man. He was always just a little bit put out on his own. Felt offended by the lower class and coarseness of this man's lifestyle, quite frankly. So he is removed from that and he denies himself that, but now it seems okay. The world has moved on. The standards have perhaps settled a little bit, and his kids are freer to pursue their own passions than he ever was. Newland has just settled into a role of a society gentleman. He's filled with... He fills his days with philanthropy and public service, including a single elected term in the New York State Senate. He did so at the prodding, and in a very amusing little cameo, at the prodding of another of the more unconventional members of that same New York society, President Theodore Roosevelt, whom Wharton knew and grew up with in many ways. He had died shortly before the publication of this novel, even the serialization of this novel. So that reality of that age ending is very much embodied in the example of Theodore Roosevelt, who in many ways represented the newer generation, the coming era than anybody, but who was still very much a creature of that. So it's another sense of the passing of time. This person is gone too. And by name-checking Theodore Roosevelt, that also gets you a little bit more universality than just saying that, well, you know, somebody else from that tiny little circle, Lawrence Lefferts or someone, perhaps. Well, he died. That doesn't have the emotional oomph that a Teddy Roosevelt cameo would. We learn as well that May has died, leaving Newland a widower in his 50s. The prior use of that word emancipating echoes through this realization. We're told that he honestly mourns for her, even as that mourning takes on a cast of social obligation rather than a real personal meaning. We're told their long years together had shown him that it did not so much matter if marriage was a dull duty as long as it kept the dignity of a duty. Lapsing from that, it became a mere battle of ugly appetites. Which is a interesting, in its own way, heroic conception of marriage. You are holding up standards. You are holding up the dignity of the institution, even at the cost of your own vitality, and the refusal to let life degenerate into coarseness, into something ugly and animalistic, ugly appetites. When the scene shifts to Paris, Newland and his son have to go on a business trip. Newland's son has to go on a business trip. He is being sent to Paris to go do a little quick research so that somebody in New York can have can style his home as the people in Paris. A little cross-cultural envy and stuff like that Newland was, or that Wharton was always so acute to. But the subtext of the trip, and well, Newland goes along at Dallas's invitation. Dallas says, "Come on, let's go, you and me, Dad." And it's a very informal, chummy way of talking that you get the sense Newland didn't really use terribly much when he was growing up, when he was a younger man. But this feels a little fresh, a little bit chummier, a little bit more informal. Dallas is getting married soon to the daughter of the Beauforts, which you can see as either, all things, everything always changes, or the more things change, the more they stay the same. They're marrying within the same circle, but suddenly the Beauforts are accepted again. It's the echo of the earlier line in reaction to the Beauforts' financial crisis, saying, one day our children will be marrying Beaufort's brats. Okay, fine. But that is another signal of the changing mores, the liberalizing, if you will, culture coming to fruition. So Dallas is inviting his father along. Come on, Dad. Let's go have some fun. And he's trying to perhaps get his dad out of the funk of being a lonely older man at this point. But the unspoken agenda of this is a reunion with Olenska. Olenska has been living in Paris for quite some time now, and Newland would be able to go over and perhaps visit. And Dallas admits that, yeah, I've been aware for quite some time, as everybody has apparently in New York, that, yeah, you had a little bit of a relationship with her. You had a little bit of a perhaps chaste romance even. And this is a very touching moment between a son and his father, a grown son and his father, coming to terms with their own dreams and limitations. Newland's son even relates an incident with May on her deathbed. She said she knew we were safe with you and always would be because once, when she asked you to, you'd given up the thing you most wanted. Archer received this strange communication in silence. His eyes remained unseeingly fixed on the thronged sunlit square below the window. At length, he said in a low voice, "She never asked me." Now, note the regard for self-denial and the value of endurance in the face of obstacles. Also, there is a regard for silence itself. Archer listens in silence and ultimately reveals that the promise he'd kept was unspoken from the start. You can see this as a matter of interpretation. You can see it many different ways. It is also, given that the memory of this internal monologue was of his internal monologues and the dramatic dialogues with Ellen that spice the novel before this culminating point. It's a remarkable contrast in his total subjugation. This can also be read as a very sweetly sentimental moment between father and son. If you read that "She Never Asked Me" as a sincere expression of a father's overwhelming love for his children, this is pure sentiment. It's the kind of moment that sees a single tear running down the cheek of a main character as the violin music swells and the credits roll. It's an acceptance of the conventions of realist aesthetics, where humanity can strive against the natural limitations of the world, but ultimately fail. You can also read that as that line, "She never asked me," as a point of bitterness, as a point of irritation, like "she never asked me." Resentment, which would be a giving in to that same animalistic, resentful, hostile coarseness that he has so long fought against. Either way, it bears the sting of melodrama, so to speak. Contrast that moment to the famous ending. Archer sits outside Olenska's house while his son goes in. Newland just, maybe I'll be up in a little bit. I don't want to go. And he's sitting there. And he can see Olenska's window. And he knows that it's peopled. People are up there, and all he has to do is go in, and he's free now. He is 50. He is a widower. The moral climate has perhaps cooled a little bit, and no one would look askance at him reuniting with somebody after so many years of faithful marriage to his lawful wife. He can. That's a very realistic option right now. He is free. But the scene is heartbreaking in a very different way. Archer sat down at the bench and continued to gaze at the awninged balcony. He calculated the time it would take his son to be carried up in the lift to the 5th floor, to ring the bell and to be admitted to the hall, and then ushered into the drawing room. He pictured Dallas entering that room with his quick, assured step and his delightful smile, and wondered if the people were right who said that the boy, quote, took after him. Then he tried to see the persons already in the room, for probably at that sociable hour there would be more than one, and among them a dark lady, pale and dark, who would look up quickly, half rise, and hold out a long, thin hand with 3 rings on it. He thought she would be sitting on a sofa corner near the fire, with azaleas banked behind her on the table. "It's more real to me than if I went up," he suddenly heard himself say, and the fear lest shadow of reality should lose its edge kept him rooted to his seat as the minutes succeeded one another, each other. He sat for a long time on the bench in the thickening dusk, his eyes never turning from the balcony. At length, a light shone through the window, and a moment later a manservant came out of the balcony, drew up the awnings, and closed the shutters. At that, as if it had been the signal he waited for, Newland Archer got up slowly and walked back alone to his hotel. Archer prefers the image in his mind to the reality that's finally open to him. It's not the sentimental embrace of star-crossed lovers. It's not even the graceful acceptance of old friends, meeting face to face but realizing that they've missed their moment. Either of those options would be pat melodrama. Instead, we have this, a scene with a little explanation, just a series of impressions from which we have to draw our own conclusions, our own meaning. Newland, the the lonely artist of life, stalwart of uncompromising standards, chooses the ideal in his mind more than the reality. Critics have discussed this for as long as the book has been published, and many of them argue that this novel is an example of a so-called Bildungsroman, which is German for the story of a young character's growth. Bildung means education in German. But the Age of Innocence is more of a Kunstelroman, which is the story of an artist's development. In the earliest 20th century, Newland is an artist of renunciation. He doesn't write, paint, or really do anything that can be shared or even recognized by society. But the artist's role in modernism is to stop pandering to the crowd with simple art and strive for a more personal ideal, more individual ideal. That's what he's doing by walking away. The renunciation is a positive act rather than a passive acceptance. And that's what this novel is doing. It's renouncing the melodrama of realist aesthetics and the neat conclusions that happen in popular fiction, but not in life. In this struggle, these two artistic modes of realism and modernism clash continually. And each instance of one is the predicate for the shock of the other. This is the real drama of this novel. Wharton herself is the artist at the heart of this Kunstelroman. That struggle between these two modes is everything in this book. The characters, the story, the lifestyle porn that decorates it throughout, that's all just window dressing. The heart of it is a struggle for what art can be and what individual artists like Wharton can make it be, or at least can attempt to participate in. As high modernism starts to fire in the early 20th century.